Hello, and thank you for joining me again for this series. This is part 1.4, and the second of 3 parts in which I attempt to provide an in-depth analysis of the experience that caused my undertaking of this project. As a quick warning before I start on this section, the following will certainly be the most abstract and difficult of this entire introduction, and I want you to know that if absolutely nothing in this video conveys any sense to you at all, you should not take that to mean that the same will be found for what comes after it. I did deliberate as to whether it was wise to talk about this topic at this stage, but ultimately I want to relieve myself of all my anecdotes before I embark upon my work, which is academic. This is to say, the following is an early attempt at expressing the vague and mysterious sense of understanding that I felt that I'd gained prior to embarking upon my mission to convey myself in a much more comprehensible manner. Therefore, I do not feel that this should make sense to you, and again, it will not hurt your understanding of my work if you'd wish to skip this section entirely. For those of you who want the complete story, however, the following is meaningful, and it will be interesting to see how this information emerges in a different form within my more rigorous and philosophical endeavours described in later sections. So, this section will be a continuation of the previous section in which I gave an account of the complementary relationship between meaning and reason as it appeared in my initial experience. Meaning and reason, or more specifically, the meaning of and reason for existence, represent 2 complementary ways of understanding our world, the why and the how. They are not merely the explanations of existing things, but are also the underlying cause of those things. They are the conditions required to allow for existence to arise within them. They are the potential meaning why and reason how reality could exist that is required for its existence in the actual. Meaning confers a subjective, holistic understanding of the nature of things, while reason confers an objective understanding that divides the world into causes and effects. Meaning and reason are not, therefore, independent entities. Without a meaning why things exist, there can be no reason how things exist, just as without a reason how, there can be no meaning why. However, when the human mind attempts to intellectualize this meaning-reason construct, we inevitably find that we are unable to account for the nature of causality through a singular and all-encompassing modality. That is, meaning and reason appear to express conflicting properties, and one of the things that I realized in my experience was that a large part of the history of philosophy comes down to how different individuals interpret the relationship between meaning and reason respectively. Meaning expresses a condition of wholeness, of permanence and continuity, while reason expresses a condition of fragmentation, of temporality and discreteness. This conflict of quality can only find harmony with the intellect, which works by putting things in categories, if we should be able to define meaning as a consequence of reason, or reason as a consequence of meaning. That is, we are simply unable to conceive of the meaning-reason construct as the unified entity that it actually is. We divide it into 2. Thus, my experience was essentially a recognition of the perpetual process of division that is undertaken by the intellect throughout every aspect of experience. Somehow I was able to retain in experience an instant before these divisions were made, before meaning and reason were cut asunder by the mind. Now, in this section, I'm going to attempt to give an account of this process of separation, and this is something for which I simply did not have words for a very long time. Gradually, I've come to be aware of the meaning and reason constructs in terms of 2 interactive properties that epitomize this process of causality in regard to phenomenal experience. These properties are those of continuity and discreteness respectively. These properties are applied to reality as the mind becomes aware of it. They are the lenses through which we see the world, being unable to experience it as unity, and needing to translate it into a language that conforms to our capacity to comprehension. Now, by labelling meaning as continuous, what I mean is that meaning has no discernible internal structure. It is a fluid entity that contains no gaps and cannot be broken down into individual parts. In other words, if we were to attempt to decompose the meaning why reality exists analytically and inquire into its structure, at no point would we find any breaks or divisions, just more and more of the very same meaning. By labeling reason as discrete, on the other hand, I mean just the opposite. Reason is an atomic construct that is composed of parts, and we are therefore able to talk about reason in terms of the fragments which compose it. Again, meaning cannot be broken down into fragments which can be conceived of individually, while reason is, by its very nature, constituted of individual fragments, of individual reasons, and reasons for reasons, and so on. For the student of philosophy, one might be inclined to associate meaning with the Aristotelian notion of the formal and final cause, and reason to efficient and material causes, though this should be taken with a grain of salt. The point is that this distinction in composure between meaning and reason is what leads to the quite different interpretations of reality that the thinker is led to through the practice of philosophy, science, or spirituality. Meaning, on the one hand, cannot be described rationally by means of words and definitions, for any attempt to force meaning into the categories of language is necessarily to split it up into fragments, thus betraying the essence of its continuous nature. Reason, on the other hand, is describable with language, and this is precisely why I call it reason. It is rational, definable, comprehensible, and philosophical. Science is itself a manifestation of reason. It is our attempt to split the world into fragments in order to get at the fundamental elements and causes of the phenomenal world. Now, I experienced the existence of these entities that I have labelled meaning and reason directly as structures built into the fundamental architecture of the psyche, but as I have already mentioned, they also comprise a potentiality that exists beyond the mind. We know that this must be the case because we know that reality exists, and so there is, necessarily, a meaning as to why and a reason or explanation as to how reality does exist, at least from our humanly perspective. The meaning and reason of reality are then, in one sense, consequences of the fact that reality exists, but in another, it is the existence of reality that is a consequence of there being a meaning why and a reason how it could exist, or rather, a consequence of there being the potential for reality to exist. Indeed, if there were no potential for reality, then there would be no reality at all. And furthermore, if there was no such thing as reality, but there could be, then there would be a meaning why and a reason how it could exist. And so this is what I refer to when I say the potentiality of reality. In this way, then, meaning and reason need not be considered actual or real entities. Rather, they are expressions of that which has the potential to be real and actual. If our universe were to one day vanish into dust, the empty and eternal womb of potential would persist unchanged and unaffected. Whether meaning and reason should be considered to have any existence at all is therefore not important. The point is that they are meaningful concepts whether they do or not. It is the distinctly potential form of the meaning-reason relation that comprises the possibility of there being such a thing as existence at all. In this form, meaning and reason are not distinguishable entities, but are fused together as the unitary entity that we may call potential. They are the human interpretations of the underlying nothingness from which our universe becomes. It is only when the potential meets the actual, in the form of our experience, that the distinction between meaning and reason becomes manifest, and reason becomes describable as memory. It is the process of the division of the potential that allows our dualistic experience to become real. So, while the meaningful and the rational appear to us as separate entities, expressing different properties and constrained by nature in different ways, they are only separate insofar as they are perceived by us through the lens of duality, as instantiated by the subjective and objective points of reference. The external, objective world appears to adhere to fundamental laws of nature, and so is intelligible, rationally, in terms of discrete facts about how the world works. It is in this sense that reason constitutes the past and our memory of it. As we observe nature, we find that there are recurrent patterns, and these patterns provide justification for what we call the laws of physics. This is how reason is related to the human endeavour of science, and indeed many approaches to philosophy. The internal, subjective world, on the other hand, is a conceptual representation of the former in terms of holistic and immutable ideals. It is a projection of the world which we have in our minds. Such ideals cannot be written down as such, and they also cannot be observed externally. Yet they are nevertheless necessary for our understanding of nature, and without them, science would become merely a conglomeration of formulas and observations that are devoid of meaning altogether. However, the subjective and objective aspects of reality only exist insofar as conscious life is present to experience some underlying reality in which subject and object are not distinguished. And in a similar way, meaning and reason are only separate inasmuch as they are experienced, and when they are not experienced, they exist only implicitly within what I have referred to as potential. Such potential cannot be described as subjective nor objective, neither continuous nor discrete, and not meaningful nor rational. The innately singular nature of meaning and reason is an important point to realize here, because it necessitates that when they are brought out of coherence by conscious experience, they must retain perfect congruency and isomorphism, by which I mean that every portion of one must be associated and correlated with an equivalent portion of the other. They must always have the same shape, complexity, and structure, because they are fundamentally a single thing. As an analogy, the German physicist Pascal Jordan once suggested that the positive energy of the world's cosmological structures and the negative energy of their gravitational fields may together comprise zero total energy, and if this were true, then it could be possible for a universe to arise out of nothing. This line of reasoning was actually expressed in Lawrence Krauss's A Universe from Nothing, the book that initially set me on this journey. In this analogy, meaning is to negative energy, to gravity, as reason is to positive energy, to the attractive forces of nature. And as many of you will know, the physics of the past century has centered around the challenge of finding a way to make general relativity and quantum mechanics, two seemingly incompatible theoretical frameworks, play together in a fundamental theory of everything. Before the universe began, the two were scrunched up together in a neutral potentiality, and as the universe evolves, they move further and further apart. They are, simultaneously, one and two, both unitary and dual. Now, since reason is composed of discrete parts, the only way that it can be a perfect reflection of meaning, which is a continuous whole, is if reason was composed of infinitely many separate discrete parts. This would be analogous to taking a digital sampling, which is discrete, of an analog signal, which is continuous, after each infinitesimal duration of time. This is because a continuum, being infinitely divisible, can only perfectly correlate with an equally infinite number of parts. A perhaps simpler example would be trying to construct a circle as a continuous curve with an infinite number of discrete lines of infinitesimal length. We can think of the number of parts of reason and memory as representing the complexity of any explanation we can give as to the existence of reality, or perhaps as the number of chunks that the rational mind has split reality into in order to comprehend it. We can talk about reason as our collective memory because, as time goes on, our understanding of the natural world through science becomes more complex. In a sense, our collective memory grows ever larger. As more parts of memory are differentiated out of potential and our understanding increases in both completeness and complexity, reason and memory begin to look more and more alike. but only an infinitely complex composition of memory is sufficient to perfectly mirror the why of existence, which is its continuous meaning. In this way, the teleological goal of human reason is to reach the same state we were in before the first experience occurred, when memory and meaning were indistinguishable and one. Nevertheless, it is clear that the world may only be rational insofar as it comprises a finite number of parts, just as existence can only be explained insofar as there is an explanation of it that would take a finite amount of time to recall. There is, therefore, a tension that occurs between the infinite and pre-experiential state of reason as it exists implicitly within potential, and the finite state of reason as memory that has been separated from meaning within phenomenal experience. It is from this tension that time and causality arise, as I will attempt to express. So, insofar as reason is finite in its complexity, each of its finite number of component parts must be correlated with an equally finite division within meaning, but meaning, being continuous, can never actually be divided. Rather, the parts of reason must be corresponded with equivalent proportions within meaning. This is how they retain their equivalence. However, the parts of reason will never be able to cover the entire range of meaning so long as they are finite in number, and this is because a continuous system cannot be divided into a finite number of proportions of perfectly equal size. You see, as I mentioned, a continuum might be thought of as containing an infinite number of infinitesimal fragments, and so there are no discrete points within the continuum in which fragments can be separated from their neighbours. Any point at which we attempt to divide the continuum will be a part of the continuum itself. This is precisely what it means to be continuous. There are simply no gaps or spaces within the structure, for all points are a part of the continuum. Thus, the only way to decompose a continuum would be to isolate an infinitesimal point within it and treat this point as a limit which separates that which is either side of it. These limit points may be included within the proportions of the continuum, but there will always be one too many or one too few limit points than there are numbers of parts. For example, if we take a 100 centimeter long length and divide it in two, we can use just one limit point at 50 centimeters, and this point cannot be included within either of the halves without making them unequal by an infinitesimal magnitude. That is, whenever we divide something, there will always be one less division than there are resultant fragments. One division creates two parts, two divisions create three, four divisions create 5 parts, and so on and so forth. For discrete sequences, such as integers or the atoms comprising a material object, these divisions will simply take place in between elements of the sequence, but for a continuum, there are no in-between points. If each division within a continuum then represents an infinitesimal magnitude, there will inevitably be one infinitesimal, one division that is left unaccounted for, and this is an important part of the secret underlying the notion of causality, at least as far as my experience seemed to imply. This is because the infinitesimal inequality that is generated between a discrete reason and a continuous meaning is what generates the autonomous expansion of memory, which manifests as the development of the phenomenal world and the very notion of time itself. Of course, dividing a continuum, or partitioning an interval, is a topic of study in geometry and mathematics, and a true demonstration of this unavoidable inequality would certainly surpass my arithmetical abilities, let alone be very interesting to listen to. To attempt to put this in slightly more formal verbiage, however, if we were to partition a closed interval, that is, an interval that contains its start and end limit points, into two subintervals, we will find that it is impossible for those subintervals to be geometrically congruent, or equivalent. This is because one of the subintervals would need to be half open, or exclude one limit point, while the other is closed, containing both limit points. And since any congruency between the two subintervals would need to preserve the open or closedness of the intervals, the subintervals must either be unequal or they must not contain the entirety of the original interval. Now, I've no doubt that this will all sound very confusing for most people at this point, so if I could be forgiven by the mathematicians for a moment, one way to think about this that might make things clearer is to imagine meaning and reason as encapsulating the concepts of oddness and evenness, in such a sense that any integer magnitude that we might ascribe to meaning will always be an odd number, while any we ascribe to reason will always be even. Thus, if the complexity of reason was expressed by the number 10, then the closest value that meaning could be is 11. If reason was 500 million, then meaning would be 500 million and 1. As the complexity of reason increases and the numbers become larger, the relative size of the inequality between meaning and reason becomes smaller, because the difference between the two magnitudes never changes. The presence of this inequality might then be thought of as an area of negative pressure, which imparts a force on memory, driving it to expand. In experiential terms, one might be inclined to liken this force to the notion of will, to the incorrigible curiosity of humankind, of the recognition of the ability to perceive, of the power to knowledge and life. Phenomenal experience is, in a sense, sucked out of potential purely as a mean to find balance. Now, this infinitesimal remainder that emerges within the structure of potential is a very curious thing, because it is excluded from the correlation between meaning and reason entirely, and thus it is not a part of time or experience or the development of our awareness of the world. It is always separate. Normally, any infinitesimal fragment of meaning or any continuous entity must be itself a continuum also. This is because continuums are infinitely divisible and cannot contain any discrete and atomic parts. Yet the infinitesimal remainder produced by the relationship between meaning and reason is not so easily defined because it maintains the strange state of being both infinitely divisible and infinitely divided. This is because if the remainder was further divisible, then it could be further separated out into and included within the proportions created by the division of the continuum. Thus, the infinitesimal remainder is distinctly indivisible. It is an atom, much like a fragment of reason, and thus it expresses an even deeper complementarity of continuity and discreteness, containing its own inequality which is identical to itself. The infinitesimal is an infinitely self-referential fractal, a spiral beyond comprehension, being both continuous and discrete. It assumes a novel state of being that is ontologically distinct from the potential of which it is born. It is the first entity that exists in the actual. It is, by virtue of the separation between the potential and the actual, that the world of phenomena comes into being. For this infinitesimal monad, being the essence of existence, is what gives all other things their reality. It is the self-reflective relationship between the infinitesimal actual and the infinite potential that generates our finite world of things. It is the relationship between being and non-being that generates all becoming. The remainder is the primordial reality, and its relationship with potential expresses a similar complementarity as that which exists between continuity and discreteness. The infinitesimal remainder is caused by the tension between continuity and discreteness, yet within the remainder itself is that very same duality, and this is the essence of the self-generating nature of conscious experience. Reality is a consequence of the potential that potential itself might come to know itself. The potential and the actual are reciprocal and interdependent, neither existing without the other. The whole of existence resonates itself out of the nothingness by virtue only of the feedback loop contained within it. The remainder is that final fragment of potential that cannot be translated into the categories of reason. It is that which no strictly empirical science will ever be able to include formally within its equations. It is the minuscule, overlooked, and trivialized portion of existence that gives everything else its sense of reality. It is the bridge that binds past as memory and future as meaning. It is the invisible witness that stands before all content and all context. The remainder is the present moment and all awareness of it. It is the very notion of reality, which is reality itself. There is no reality without notion, without conception, and this conception of reality is the true, collective and shared self called I. It is the essence of the concept reality. It is our one free miracle, albeit an absolutely essential one. So now, this was really the core of my experience, causality, and the way I think about this has changed little from the moment in which it occurred. It was a feeling of absolute conviction then, as it is now. The core of my experience was a direct understanding that the internal structure of the potential for existence is sufficient to necessarily cause reality to exist in the actual. Again, the relationship between the potential for existence and actual existence persists in the very same reciprocal, recursive, and mutually dependent way that meaning and reason, along with all other dualities, are grounded. There is no reality without potential. There is no potential without reality. Potentiality, by virtue of its own non-reality, is necessarily infinite. One cannot have a finite amount of nothing. Actual existence, or actuality, on the other hand, is the one true infinitesimal, for only an entity that is so meagre and insignificant that for all practical and indeed mathematical purposes it doesn't exist at all, could ever actually exist as a result of necessity. Finite things cannot appear spontaneously in the world out of nothing. Yet the infinite and the infinitesimal are the complementary aspects of this fundamental nothing, of chaos, and when taken together, the infinite potential and the infinitesimal actual are perfectly balanced forms, each being the inverse of the other. In one sense, infinite potentiality is more than mere potential due to its infiniteness, and infinitesimal actuality is less than actual due to its infinitesimalness. Both are essentially neutral in their existence, and neither are real in the sense that we normally talk about things like physical objects. Nevertheless, the potential and the actual are complementary to each other, and their interdependence forms a recursive relationship that provides the foundation for the creation of what we, as humans, would consider to be real phenomena, as our finite world of things. Yet, while we normally consider the phenomenal world to be that which is fundamental to experience, the phenomenal world is actually an expression of a more fundamental nothing, comprising the infinite potential and the infinitesimal actual. All things arise in relation to something else which complements and balances that thing out, and this fact is what provides us with the keys to the temple of knowledge, to the one reliable fact that we can all know for sure that reality cannot not exist. Nature abhors a vacuum. The integral structure of the possibility that nothing could have ever existed, of the concept of genuine non-existence, is simply absurd in principle. For if there was and could be no such thing as reality, there would be no such thing as the meaning why and reason how nothing exists. There would simply just be nothing. Only reality is possible, and there's a meaning to all of this, and to why we suffer, as our suffering carries us to our final, inevitable destination, which is the complete realization of meaning through a progressively complex reason and a completely self-aware identity. Well, I'm glad we've got that over with. Thank you for listening to this installment, and I hope I haven't given you as much of a headache with this as I've given myself over these past years. Before you go, I just want to remind you one last time that this section is purely me trying to give words to my experience and is not intended to be theoretical or philosophical in nature. it is likely that my interpretation is still not complete, and I include this only for the purpose of transparency and completeness in regard to my journeys within philosophy. Thank you again, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.